Tonight, a landmark opioid case settled with Johnson & Johnson now ordered to pay more than $500 million in damages. We're going to take a look at how this could be a game changer. Then famed women's rights attorney Gloria Allred joins us. She's representing accusers of both Jeffrey Epstein and Harvey Weinstein. And we also look at the hot car deaths of children and how they're not all treated equally in the eyes of the law. Good evening, everybody, and welcome to RFL. Thank you so much for joining us this Wednesday evening. I'm Richard French. Now, we start tonight with something that, unfortunately, we talk about all too often, the opioid epidemic. Now, on this program, we've spoken with victims. We've spoken to doctors, attorneys, parents who've lost their kids to overdoses and addiction, and those recovering as well. Now, major lawsuits are finally winding their way through the courts. There are literally thousands of suits as we speak. Now, for the most part, they allege that the drug companies deceptively marketed addictive and potentially deadly pills and also didn't have proper safeguards to prevent abuse and addiction. Just yesterday, a judge in Oklahoma ruled that Johnson & Johnson helped fuel the crisis in that very state. The company has been ordered to pay $572 million in damages. J&J planning to appeal. Now, the Attorney General of Oklahoma spoke after the decision was announced.
Johnson & Johnson will finally be held accountable for thousands of deaths and addiction caused by their activities. The company used pseudoscience and misleading information that downplay the risks of opioids, leading to the worst man-made public nuisance our state and this country has ever seen.
That ruling happening in the wake of a shocking report that showed the extent of this crisis and how much was actually known. 76 billion, and again, that's with a B, 76 billion pills were distributed just between the years 2006 and 2012. That resulted in nearly 100,000 opioid-related deaths during that 6-year period. The data also showed which areas were hit hardest. The number of pills distributed just in West Virginia equaled 66 per person per year. And when I say per person, that includes every man, woman, and child. Kentucky not far behind with 63 per individual per year. South Carolina, Tennessee, Nevada rounding out the ignominious top 5. Then there are the Sacklers and Purdue Pharma. Now, they are one of the faces of this crisis as they own Purdue, the maker of OxyContin. Now, just like other drug companies, they're facing a slew of lawsuits. But now, the Sacklers have reportedly offered to pay $3 billion of their own money to settle all the claims. The company would cough up as much as $9 billion in additional. Now, if this goes through, Purdue will be the first major company to settle all of its claims in one huge deal. Joining us now, the regular faces of our legal panel, James Kousouros. He's a criminal defense attorney in Manhattan, sitting on the board of directors of the New York City Criminal Bar Association, and he also frequently lectures at New York Law School and the bar associations in Queens and New York City. Doug von Oiste. He's a founding partner of Carson von Oiste, focusing on corporate misconduct and also selected by the Legal 500 as one of the most influential trial lawyers in the country. And Mayo Bartlett. He's an attorney at the law offices of Mayo Bartlett PLLC, and he's former chief of the Bias Crimes Unit at the Westchester County DA's office. All right, gentlemen. I spoke to an attorney a few weeks back who was involved in another suit in West Virginia, in fact. And he said the game changer, the day that the public got to see that database that Big Pharma, all the big pharmas had been privy to, which showed not just the volume of pills, but where the pills were going by geography, where by town, let alone county, and they then also saw the number of addictions for both opioids and then what would be the gateway to obviously heroin and et cetera, that when it became too expensive, the opioids, so many of these addicts went that route. They knew. And I guess my question is, people are going to focus, and we'll talk about the math. I'll do that with Doug in a second in terms of the actual case. But Jimmy, is this not the beginning of the end of Big Pharma? We're relying as a country, as a globe on it, but this is going to be, I think, seismic. It can't be, this is just the beginning of what happened today in Oklahoma. We're going to see this everywhere, aren't we?
We are, but it's not going to be the end of Big Pharma. This is an isolated, drug, an isolated addictive drug that these companies were just pushing and pushing incessantly while knowing. I mean, when you look at a statistic like 63 pills per person, including infants, it's just a staggering statistic. It is going to be seismic, and I think that you look at this settlement that's being proposed now, it is going to dramatically affect these companies, and it may also limit their profits going forward because they're going to have to pay attention when they're producing these drugs and when they're used in such large quantities and having deleterious effects as opposed to beneficial effects.
And I would add from the political side, Washington, and it's not a one-party thing, Washington has looked the other way because Big Pharma is hugely influential on the lobbying side. That means money. And they've allowed them basically to set their own prices. They've allowed them to make whatever the margin was, and they've allowed them to basically look away. We always talk in this program about how the gun industry is immune, as it seems, for the consequences of their product. Big Pharma, in many ways, was too, even if it wasn't encapsulated in statute. Now, Doug, let's talk math here. A lot of people were shocked that the number was only, and I put that in quotes, 570-something million bucks. Get to that number in a second, but Johnson & Johnson was considered by many the gold standard here. I mean, they've gotten rid of products before compared to other big pharma, at the first hint that there was a problem, Tylenol, remember all that stuff. So were you surprised, not just Monday morning quarterbacking, but were you surprised they chose to take this to trial instead of settling?
No, because it wasn't a jury trial. There was a judge who listened to the evidence in this case and made a decision. The number really is a low number when you think about it. Mm-hmm. If you're using that number to gauge the liability of all these other pharmaceutical companies across the country, that number is very low. So at some point they were going to test these cases. So if you wanted to test these cases, if you were the defendant, if you were the pharma company, you would want to test it in front of a federal court judge in a conservative place like Oklahoma. You don't want to do it in front of a jury. Can you imagine what a jury would have done and what they would have awarded? It wouldn't have been $571 million.
I mentioned the thousands and thousands of these cases. Explain how this works in terms of now precedent. Is there a model that's now created? Because, okay, federal judge comes back with this. This was the number of, in effect, impacted defendants in Oklahoma. This was the number for the settlement. Is that just restricted to this case, or is this now applied going forward?
These numbers are for this case. Now, defendants will argue now there are historical numbers. It's much lower than you thought. You're asking for a settlement at X and it should be at Y. Plaintiffs' attorneys will say, and I'll agree with them, that this has nothing to do with that. If you put these cases in front of jurors that listen to that same information, these numbers will be much, much higher.
Mayo, the human part of this, I mentioned the Sackler case, and yes, people are going to focus on the numbers, the $3 billion out of their pockets and another $9 billion. But when, and I know you have, when people read the thread here from the Sacklers, I mean, at one point they talked about they wanted this from nose to tail, which was they knew what their products were doing. And while some said, hey, not my problem, it kind of reminded me of the housing crisis we had in this country in 2008. Hey, if people can't afford the mortgages, they shouldn't be taking them their problem, even though they knew what they were putting into the marketplace. In this case, we're not talking about a mortgage, we're talking about life and death. They knew what their products were doing to the point where they said, hey, we got to get in on some of the money on the rehabs. So not only were they providing the drugs that they knew were going into which communities and the addictive rate attached to it, but they were also trying to, and did, set up rehab facilities so those same people that were buying their products would then have to pay them to get treatment for the addiction. Callous is too polite a word for what they did. That database showed us these guys knew what was going on, and I find no rationale where they could say, you know what, this was a product that we were all surprised how it got misused. Please.
Well, again, this is a poster child for why you need regulation. Anybody who thinks you don't, and it's astonishing that most of the states that we're looking at are red states. These are states that vote for people who say there should be no regulation. When you have no regulation, you get 66, 67 pills per person. There probably aren't 67 aspirins per person. But also you have to stop and look at the fact that there's virtually no criminal consequence. So we talk about drug dealers in terms of the guy that sells marijuana, the guy that sells heroin, cocaine, a bag here or there, and they make a little bit of money. They generally live in a place that you don't want to be. They're not thriving. These are corporations that thrive off of poisoning the American public, off of stealing generations of people's lives, intergenerational impact. If you lose a loved one, your mother, your father, son, daughter, that no amount of money brings that person back. And we were speaking earlier, $572 million. If you were able to show that a drug dealer gave bad heroin to a person and that person brought a lawsuit, the verdict probably would be more than $1 million. So basically you're talking about 572 people or fewer. And the other thing is that although we like to say corporations are people, corporations can go into different versions of bankruptcy. They can disappear and reemerge. But what never comes back are the people who are opioid addicted and people who've lost their lives.
And again, I want to put a fine point on this because there are people, and I understand the argument, which says, wait a minute, this is pain medication that we may have developed that was approved by the FDA, and then doctors had to prescribe. That would be fine if the company said, we never knew where it went. But when I say in certain states there was more than 60 pills per person, as Jimmy said, you're talking infants too, there were counties where more than 300 pills per person were consumed every year. Now, think about that. I'm hoping there's no kids under 14 taking, oxy, for injuries they suffered on the battlefield, okay? So my point is, you take the seniors out of this, you take the kids out, and you take 300 pills per person and now multiply that with the remaining population. They knew it, and they still flooded the communities, and they knew the impact and the consequences because in the same database that they all shared, they then knew where this transitioned to heroin. And again, this was between years 06 and 12, and the problem has only been exacerbated in the last 6 or 7 years. I don't know, Jimmy. I mean, all of you guys served as prosecutors here. Who do we point the finger at the most? Do we look at the federal government? Do we look at the state level? Do we go to Big Pharma? Where do we say, who's supposed to look out for us?
Well, it's like Mayo said before, the federal government and state prosecutors, they're going after these drug dealers all the time. They have, SWAT teams basically that flood areas in order to arrest drug dealers who were selling a bag or two or, whatever. This information was readily available to everybody. So in my view, you have to look at the federal government, you have to look at the United States Attorney's offices who have access to these numbers just as easily as Big Pharma did. When all of these deaths are occurring...
The DEA had access to this information in addition to Big Pharma. And after multiple lawsuit after lawsuit, finally, they agreed to the FOIA request and they made it public. And then for me, I don't know how any Big Pharma can win any case going forward after it's in black and white. You knew what this did, and you knew where it was going, and you knew in the volume it was being distributed.
Did the federal government not know that banks were lying about the value of properties, that Moody's was rating, junk bonds as AAA bonds? I mean, it's what you said before. If you have money and you have clout and you have the lobbyists, you get over. That's what happens.
But what happens too is that what we're not talking about is all the companies that want to go into a particular town in Alabama or in West Virginia, but they can't because the population there is ill-equipped to take the job. So you have towns that will die as a result of this happening. We don't talk about that. We always have these promises that you're going to thrive, you're going to bring back industry. You can't hire somebody to go and take a precision job or a job even where you require them to be there on time if they're opioid addicted. It's not going to happen.
Just so quickly, I was in Buffalo 2 weeks ago and I saw a fella get sentenced to 28 years in jail. 28 years in jail. He was 22 years old, 23 years old. He sold heroin to somebody who died. And the way they were able to prove it was text messages between him and the buyer. I'm not saying that he shouldn't be punished, but what I am saying is man caused one death, which is inexcusable, but they went after him, and there are criminal consequences.
Doug, you spent the latter part of your career going after companies who negligently put a product in the marketplace that caused a lot of harm to people. Not a direct line here, but there is a through line that I can see. Is the only way to change behavior through the pocketbook? Or, to me, somebody really should go to jail for this. This is criminal what happened. I mean, wouldn't that accelerate the change in the reporting structure? Because at the end of the day, if it's not just a fine, but you're putting on an orange jumpsuit, tends to concentrate the mind.
Listen, Rich, a corporation's job to the stockholders is to make money. So when they're in the boardroom and they're trying to make money for the stockholders, they're selling as much of the product as you can. They know they're doing something wrong when they're doing it, but they can't stop themselves because they're making money. Now, if you don't, as a citizen, if you don't look at those facts, and corporations set up like that all over this country, and if you don't look at that as criminal conduct when they know people are getting hurt, it'll never change. I'm thinking about tobacco.
Yeah.
Tobacco people are smoking all over the place. They have these same conversations. These are some of the most profitable companies on the face of the earth. These pharmaceutical companies, this is just a little blip. They're going to pay the price, they're going to pay the little fine, and they're going to move on, and it'll keep on going.
I sure hope you're wrong here, but unfortunately there's a lot of evidence that says you're right. Okay, when we come back, Gloria Allred, she's representing accusers of both Jeffrey Epstein and Harvey Weinstein. She's going to join us after the break to discuss those cases and also how sexual abuse cases have changed and evolved during the Me Too era.